Brian Matthews was fixing a leaky faucet in his modest two-bedroom home when he heard the crying outside. Through his rain-streaked window, he saw a woman clutching a small boy, both soaked to the bone and shivering in the November cold. The woman's face bore fresh bruises, and the child's eyes held a fear that no 6-year-old should ever know. Brian didn't hesitate. He opened his door and invited them in, not knowing that the quiet little boy he was about to shelter was heir to one of the world's largest fortunes. He didn't know that this single act of kindness would transform all their lives forever, or that the luxury sedan that would arrive months later would bring news that would shake him to his core. But as he wrapped them in warm blankets and made hot soup, one thing was certain: sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest acts of human decency. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The woman's name was Emma Rodriguez, and she had been driving for 3 days straight with her son Leo, fleeing from a nightmare that had consumed the last 2 years of their lives. Her late husband's family had made it clear that she and Leo were no longer welcome after the funeral, and their final confrontation had left her with more than just emotional scars. The bruises on her face were still tender, a reminder of her brother-in-law's rage when she'd refused to sign away Leo's inheritance rights to properties she didn't even fully understand. Brian Matthews, 34 years old and a single father himself, had learned to recognize desperation. His own 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, lived with her mother across town, and he saw her every other weekend. The loneliness of his small house had taught him the value of human connection, and something about the woman and child's vulnerability struck deep into his heart. He didn't ask questions that first night. He simply provided what they needed most: safety, warmth, and the promise that they could stay as long as necessary. Emma's hands shook as she accepted the steaming mug of coffee Brian offered her. Leo sat curled against her side on the worn couch, his dark eyes darting around the modest living room as if expecting danger to emerge from the shadows. The boy hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived, and Emma's heart ached knowing that her son had witnessed too much violence in his short life. "I'm Brian," he said gently, settling into the chair across from them. "And you don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share, but you're safe here, both of you." His voice carried a sincerity that made Emma's eyes fill with tears. She hadn't heard genuine kindness in so long that she'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. "I'm Emma, and this is Leo," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. We needed somewhere to go." The simplicity of her words couldn't capture the complexity of their situation, but Brian nodded as if he understood completely. Leo's small fingers clutched at his mother's sleeve, and Brian noticed the way the boy flinched whenever he moved too quickly. It was a reaction Brian recognized from his years volunteering at the local community center, the defensive posture of a child who had learned that adults could be dangerous. The sight of it made something fierce and protective surge in Brian's chest. That first week passed quietly. Emma and Leo occupied the small guest room, and Brian found himself adjusting his routines to accommodate his unexpected house guests. He worked as a maintenance supervisor for the local school district, a job that required early mornings and long days but provided steady income and good benefits. His house, while modest, was his pride and joy, a 1950s bungalow he'd been slowly renovating for the past 5 years. Emma insisted on helping around the house, despite Brian's protests that she needed time to heal. She had a natural talent for organization, and found purpose in bringing order to Brian's somewhat chaotic home. Her background in accounting, she revealed gradually, had been put to use managing her late husband's family business before everything fell apart. She spoke of her husband Roberto in careful, measured tones, describing a man who had loved her and Leo deeply, but whose death in a construction accident had left them vulnerable to his family's greed and prejudice. Leo remained largely silent, but Brian noticed the boy's keen intelligence in the way he observed everything around him. When Brian worked on small repair projects around the house, Leo would hover nearby, watching with intense concentration. The child's interest sparked an idea in Brian's mind, and he began to include Leo in his weekend projects, teaching him to hold tools and explain what he was doing. "See this pipe here, Leo? Brian said one Saturday morning as they worked under the kitchen sink. "It's leaking because the connection isn't tight enough. Sometimes things just need a little attention to work properly again." Leo nodded solemnly, his small hands steady as he held the flashlight Brian had given him. It was the first time Brian had seen the boy show genuine interest in anything. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after their arrival. Brian was attempting to fix a stubborn cabinet door that had been sticking for months, muttering under his breath as he struggled with the hinges. Leo appeared beside him, studying the problem with the same intense focus Brian had come to recognize. "The wood is swollen," Leo said quietly, his first complete sentence since arriving at Brian's house. His voice was soft but clear, carrying a maturity that seemed far beyond his 6 years. "It needs to be sanded down so it fits properly." Brian paused, looking at the boy with new respect. "You're absolutely right, Leo. How did you know that?" Leo shrugged, but Brian caught a glimpse of pride in the child's dark eyes. It was a small moment, but it felt like the beginning of something important. From that day forward, Leo became Brian's eager apprentice. The boy had an intuitive understanding of how things worked, and his careful attention to detail impressed Brian constantly. Emma watched their growing bond with a mixture of relief and gratitude, seeing her son emerge from his shell for the first time since his father's death. "Roberta would have loved seeing this," she told Brian one evening as they watched Leo carefully organize Brian's toolbox, sorting screws by size and type with methodical precision. "He always said Leo had the mind of an engineer, even as a baby." Her voice carried a wistfulness that spoke of dreams interrupted and futures that would never be. As autumn deepened into winter, the small house became a true home for all 3 of them. Emma found work at a local accounting firm, her skills quickly recognized despite her lack of recent references. She insisted on contributing to household expenses, though Brian tried to refuse her money. Their evening routines developed naturally, with Emma cooking dinner while Brian helped Leo with homework, the boy having been enrolled in the neighborhood elementary school. Leo's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, called Brian one afternoon with concerns that puzzled him. "Leo is an exceptional student," she explained. "But he seems to know things that are quite advanced for his age. He was explaining compound interest to another student during math class today. And he corrected me on a historical date that I had to look up to verify. Has he been in gifted programs before?" Brian found himself looking at Leo with new curiosity. The boy's intelligence was undeniable, but there were moments when he displayed knowledge that seemed far beyond what a 6-year-old should possess. When Brian mentioned it to Emma, she grew quiet and thoughtful. "Roberto's family, they're very wealthy," she said carefully. "Leo spent a lot of time with his grandfather before Roberto died. The old man, he had very specific ideas about education and what Leo should know." She paused, choosing her words with obvious care. "I think he saw Leo as his heir to more than just money." The conversation left Brian with more questions than answers, but he didn't push Emma for details she wasn't ready to share. He had learned to read the careful way she spoke about her in-laws, the tension that crept into her voice whenever Roberto's family was mentioned. Whatever had driven them from their previous life had been serious enough to leave Emma genuinely afraid, and Brian respected her need for privacy. Winter brought new challenges and deeper connections. Sophie's visits became regular occurrences, and she quickly bonded with Leo over their shared love of building things. Brian's daughter was impressed by Leo's knowledge and patience, and the 4 of them settled into a comfortable routine that felt surprisingly natural. Emma and Sophie developed their own special relationship, with Emma helping the 8-year-old with school projects and Sophie teaching Emma about local customs and favorite places in town. One snowy February evening, as they all worked together on a massive jigsaw puzzle, Brian realized that he had stopped thinking of Emma and Leo as temporary guests. They had become part of his life in ways he hadn't expected, and the thought of them leaving filled him with an anxiety he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Emma seemed to sense his mood, and later that night, after Leo and Sophie were asleep, she brought up the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them. "Brian, I need you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done for us," she began, her voice careful and measured. But I also need you to understand that our situation is complicated in ways I haven't been able to explain. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her expression serious. Emma, you don't owe me any explanations, Brian said, though his curiosity had been growing for months. You and Leo are welcome here for as long as you need to stay. That's just it, she replied, her eyes meeting his directly. I'm not sure we can stay much longer. Roberto's family, they have resources and connections that reach far beyond what most people can imagine. I've been careful, but I know they're still looking for us, especially for Leo. She paused, taking a shaky breath. Leo's inheritance isn't just money, Brian. It's complicated, and there are people who would do anything to control it. Brian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind rattling the windows. What kind of inheritance are we talking about, Emma? Before she could answer, they were interrupted by a small voice from the hallway. Mom? Leo appeared in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes sleepily. I had the dream again. Emma's face immediately shifted into protective mother mode, and she gathered Leo into her arms. The boy's nightmares had been frequent in the early weeks, but had tapered off as he settled into their new routine. Their return worried Brian, and he watched as Emma comforted her son with practiced ease. It's okay, sweetheart, she murmured, stroking Leo's dark hair. You're safe here with Brian and me. No one can hurt you. Leo looked up at Brian with eyes that seemed to hold too much understanding for a child his age. Brian won't let them take me away, will he, Mom? The question carried a weight that made Brian's chest tighten with protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. No one is taking you anywhere, Leo, Brian said firmly, moving to kneel beside Emma's chair so he was at eye level with the boy. This is your home, and families protect each other. The words came out with a conviction that surprised him, but he realized he meant every syllable. March brought the first signs of spring and an unexpected visitor that would change everything. Brian was in the backyard with Leo, teaching him to use a level to build a proper garden frame, when Emma's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen window made them both look up. A sleek black sedan was pulling into their driveway, its tinted windows and expensive lines completely out of place in their modest neighborhood. Mom? Leo's voice carried a note of fear that Brian hadn't heard in months. Emma appeared at the back door, her face pale but determined. Leo, come inside, please, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Brian could detect. Brian, I think they've found us. The man who emerged from the sedan was elderly, but carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His tailored suit probably cost more than Brian's monthly salary, and his sharp eyes swept over the modest house with obvious assessment. He was accompanied by a younger woman in professional attire who carried herself like a lawyer or executive assistant. Brian felt Leo move closer to his side, the boy's small hand slipping into his with trust that made Brian's protective instincts surge. Whatever was about to happen, he was determined to stand between this child and any threat, regardless of how expensively dressed it might be. Emma opened the front door before the visitors could knock, her posture straight and defiant despite the fear Brian could see in her eyes. Hello, Eduardo, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I wondered when you'd find us. The elderly man's face softened slightly at the sight of her, but his eyes were sharp as they moved past Emma to focus on Leo. Emma, my dear, you've led us quite a chase, but more importantly, you've kept my grandson from his family for far too long. Brian felt the pieces clicking into place with shocking clarity. This man, with his obvious wealth and air of command, was Leo's grandfather. The inheritance Emma had spoken of in careful, frightened tones was apparently much larger than Brian had imagined. Leo isn't property to be claimed, Eduardo, Emma replied, stepping protectively between the man and her son. He's a child who has been through enough trauma. Eduardo's eyes moved to Brian, assessing him with the calculation of someone accustomed to evaluating people's worth and usefulness. And you are the man who has been caring for my grandson, I presume? His tone was neutral, but Brian sensed layers of judgment and expectation in the question. I'm Brian Matthews, he replied, moving to stand beside Emma in a show of support. Leo and Emma are part of my family now. The statement caused Eduardo's eyebrows to rise slightly, and Brian caught a hint of what might have been approval in the older man's expression. Interesting, Eduardo murmured. Leo, come here, my boy. Let your abuelo see how you've grown. Leo pressed closer to Brian's side, his small body tense with uncertainty. I don't want to go back to the big house, he said, his voice small but clear. I want to stay here with Brian and Mom. The words seemed to hit Eduardo like a physical blow, and Brian saw something shift in the old man's expression. The calculation remained, but it was joined by what looked like genuine pain and regret. The big house has been very empty without you, Leo, Eduardo said gently, his voice losing some of its authoritative edge. Your cousins miss you, and I have missed you more than I can say. Emma's laugh was bitter and sharp. His cousins miss him? Eduardo, your son threw us out of that house. He told Leo that his father was dead and that meant he was no longer really part of the family. Your other grandson called Leo names I won't repeat. And your daughter-in-law suggested that a boy of mixed heritage would never really belong in your world. The color drained from Eduardo's face, and Brian saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. Emma, I swear to you, I knew nothing of this. Carlos told me you had taken Leo and disappeared, that you were keeping him from his family out of spite. Your son has been lying to you for months, Eduardo, Emma replied, her voice gaining strength. He wanted Leo's inheritance for his own children, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen, including having me beaten when I refused to sign documents I didn't understand. The admission hung in the air like a bomb, and Brian felt his own anger surge at the confirmation of what he had suspected about Emma's injuries. Eduardo's face went through several changes of expression before settling into a mask of barely controlled fury. My son did what? The words came out as a whisper, but they carried more menace than any shout could have. Leo chose that moment to step forward, his small hand still clasped in Brian's, but his voice growing stronger. Tío Carlos said bad things about my papa, and he hurt my mama. Brian taught me that real men don't hurt people who are smaller than them. Eduardo's gaze shifted to Brian with new interest and what looked like respect. This man, Brian, he has been teaching you? He taught me how to fix things, Leo said, his confidence growing as he spoke about something he loved. And he taught me that families take care of each other, and that being different makes you special, not bad. The old man was quiet for a long moment, his sharp eyes moving between Leo, Emma, and Brian as if reassessing everything he thought he knew. Leo, would you show me some of the things Brian has taught you? Leo looked up at Brian uncertainly, and Brian nodded encouragingly. The boy led them all to the backyard, where his various projects were laid out in careful organization. The garden frame they had been working on was precise and level, the wood joints fitted together with a craftsmanship that impressed even Brian. I helped Brian fix the bathroom sink too, Leo said, his pride evident as he pointed to the house. The pipe was corroded, so he had to replace the whole joint. And I know how to use most of his tools now, but only when he's watching. Eduardo knelt down to examine Leo's work, his expensive suit forgotten as he studied the construction with obvious expertise. This is excellent craftsmanship, mijo. Your papa would be very proud. Brian says papa is always watching over me, Leo replied simply. And that he would want me to learn new things and be kind to people. Brian felt Eduardo's gaze on him again, and this time there was no assessment or judgment, only a grandfather's gratitude for the man who had cared for his grandson when family had failed. Brian, Eduardo said, rising to his full height. I owe you more than I can ever repay, but I need you to understand the complexity of Leo's situation. His inheritance includes controlling interest in Rodriguez Industries, which employs over 50,000 people worldwide. There are board members and shareholders who have been questioning Leo's disappearance, and legal challenges that require his presence to resolve. Emma stepped forward, her protective instincts still clearly engaged. Eduardo, Leo is 6 years old. He should be worried about homework and playmates, not corporate responsibilities. You're absolutely right, Emma, Eduardo replied, his tone gentle but firm. Which is why I'd spent the last 3 months restructuring everything. Leo's inheritance will be held in trust until he reaches adulthood. Managed by people I trust completely. But his legal presence is required to finalize these arrangements, and there are people who need to see that he is safe and well cared for." End quote. Brian found himself in the surreal position of mediating a conversation about billions of dollars while standing in his modest backyard. "What exactly are you asking from Leo and Emma?" Eduardo's attention focused on Brian with laser intensity. "I'm asking them to come home, but I'm also asking if you would consider becoming part of that home. Leo clearly sees you as family, and frankly, I've seen more genuine care and wisdom in the 10 minutes I've observed you with my grandson than I've seen from my own son in years." The offer hung in the air, so unexpected and overwhelming that Brian struggled to process it. Emma's eyes were wide with shock, and Leo was looking between the adults with the confused expression of a child trying to understand adult complications. "I don't understand," Brian said carefully. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a life," Eduardo replied simply. Leo needs continuity and stability, things that his biological family failed to provide. You've given him both, along with skills and values that will serve him well regardless of his financial situation. I'm asking you to continue being his father figure, with all the support and resources that entails. Emma's voice was shaky when she spoke. "Eduardo, we can't just uproot Brian's entire life. He has his own daughter, his own job, his own responsibilities." "Actually," Eduardo said, turning to his assistant, "Maria has been researching Mr. Matthews quite thoroughly." The woman stepped forward with a tablet, her professional demeanor not quite hiding her curiosity about the unusual situation. "Mr. Matthews, you have an exemplary employment record and excellent references from supervisors and coworkers," Maria said, consulting her device. "Your volunteer work with at-risk youth has been noted by several community organizations, and your financial situation, while modest, shows careful management and responsibility." Brian felt a mixture of invasion and admiration for Eduardo's thoroughness. "You investigated me. I investigate anyone who becomes important to my grandson's well-being," Eduardo replied without apology. "What I found was a man of character who has provided Leo with exactly what he needed most: stability, guidance, and unconditional care. Those qualities are rare and valuable beyond measure." Leo tugged on Brian's sleeve, drawing all the adult attention back to him. "Brian, if I have to go to the big house, will you come with me? I don't want to live somewhere without you." The simple request, delivered with a child's direct honesty, cut through all the complex adult negotiations and struck at the heart of what really mattered. Brian looked down at Leo, seeing the trust and affection that had grown between them over the months, then at Emma, whose eyes reflected her own complicated feelings about the situation. "Leo, this is a big decision that affects a lot of people," Brian said gently. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens, you'll always be important to me. We're family now, and that doesn't change based on where we live." Eduardo watched this exchange with obvious approval, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Brian, I have a proposition that might address everyone's concerns. My estate has several houses on the property, including a renovated craftsman-style home that I think you would appreciate. You could live there with your own space and independence, while being close enough to continue Leo's education in practical skills." He paused, letting the offer sink in before continuing. "Your daughter would be welcome whenever she visits, and if you're interested, there are significant opportunities within Rodriguez Industries for someone with your management skills and character. But most importantly, Leo would have the consistency of your presence as he navigates the transition back to his inheritance." Brian felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His life in the small bungalow was modest but comfortable, and the idea of moving into a world of wealth and corporate responsibility was both exciting and terrifying. But as he looked at Leo's hopeful face and Emma's cautious optimism, he realized that his choice had been made months ago when he first opened his door to a frightened woman and child. "Can I see the house?" he asked, his practical nature asserting itself even in the face of such life-changing possibilities. Eduardo's smile was the first genuine expression of joy Brian had seen from the older man. Maria, please arrange for us to visit the estate this weekend. I think Leo would enjoy showing Brian around the property. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of phone calls, arrangements, and careful conversations. Emma gradually revealed more details about the Rodriguez family wealth, explaining that Roberto's father had built a construction and development empire that now spanned multiple countries. Leo's inheritance included not just money, but properties, businesses, and responsibilities that would shape his entire future. Sophie's reaction to the news was typical of an 8-year-old, focused primarily on whether she would still get to see Brian regularly and whether Leo's new house had a swimming pool. Her practical acceptance of the situation helped ground Brian's own swirling emotions about the dramatic changes ahead. The Rodriguez estate was located an hour outside the city, sprawling across several hundred acres of carefully maintained grounds. The main house was indeed imposing, a Spanish colonial mansion that spoke of generations of wealth and tradition. But Eduardo led them directly to a smaller residence nestled among oak trees at the edge of the property. The craftsman house was perfect, exactly the kind of home Brian had always imagined himself living in someday. It featured quality construction, thoughtful details, and enough space for Brian and Sophie during her visits, while being close enough to the main house for Leo to run back and forth easily. The previous resident was my estate manager, Eduardo explained as they toured the house. He retired last year, and the position has been vacant. It would involve overseeing maintenance and improvements across the property, managing contractors and staff, and handling various projects. The salary would be considerably more than your current position. Leo had immediately claimed the workshop in the garage, pointing out all the tools and workspace available for their projects. His excitement was infectious, and Brian found himself imagining the things they could build together in such a well-equipped environment. Emma was quiet during most of the tour, but Brian caught her studying him with careful attention, as if trying to gauge his true feelings about the dramatic change being offered. When they found themselves alone for a moment in the kitchen of the craftsman house, she voiced the concern he knew had been weighing on her. "Brian, you don't have to do this just because Leo wants you to," she said softly. "This world, it's complicated and demanding in ways that can be overwhelming. I don't want you to feel obligated to give up your life for us." Brian looked out the window at Leo, who was exploring the workshop with Eduardo, the boy's animated explanations bringing obvious joy to his grandfather's face. "Emma, I've been thinking about what family means since you and Leo came into my life. It's not about blood or obligation or even proximity. It's about choosing to care for people and commit to their well-being." He turned to face her directly, his voice gaining conviction as he spoke. "I chose to care about you and Leo months ago, and that hasn't changed. If anything, seeing how happy Leo is to reconnect with his grandfather makes me want to be part of helping him navigate this transition. He's going to need someone who remembers where he came from and who he was before all this wealth and responsibility." Emma's eyes filled with tears, that they were tears of relief rather than sadness. "Are you sure, Brian?" "Really sure? I'm sure that Leo needs consistency and people who love him for who he is, not what he stands to inherit," Brian replied. "I'm sure that you deserve to feel safe and supported as you figure out your own place in all this. And I'm sure that Eduardo genuinely wants what's best for Leo, even if his family has failed him in the past." The conversation was interrupted by Leo bursting through the door, his face glowing with excitement. "Brian, there's a forge in the workshop. Abuelo says his grandfather used it to make all the ironwork for the big house. Can you teach me to use it?" Eduardo appeared behind Leo, his expression amused. "Perhaps we should start with simpler projects, mijo." "But yes, Brian, if you're willing, I would very much like Leo to learn traditional crafts alongside modern skills." The decision was made in that moment, cemented by Leo's joy and Eduardo's obvious commitment to supporting their unusual family arrangement. Over the following weeks, Brian transitioned out of his old job, sold his beloved bungalow to a young couple who appreciated its character, and prepared for a life he never could have imagined. The move itself was surprisingly smooth, with Eduardo's staff handling most of the logistics while Brian focused on helping Leo and Emma adjust to their return to the estate. The boys' cousins, Carlos's children, were initially standoffish. But Leo's natural friendliness and his obvious happiness with Brian's presence gradually wore down their resistance. Carlos himself was another matter entirely. Eduardo's son was clearly resentful of the changes his father had made, particularly the appointment of trustees who would manage Leo's inheritance and the stipulations that prevented any family member from accessing Leo's funds. His hostility toward Emma remained barely concealed, but he was careful to avoid direct confrontation in his father's presence. Brian's first major test came during a family dinner. 3 weeks after their arrival, Carlos had been drinking and started making subtle comments about Emma's background and her appropriateness as Leo's guardian. The conversation was heading toward ugly territory when Leo, who had been quietly eating his dinner, suddenly spoke up. "Uncle Carlos, Brian taught me that when someone is being mean to people you care about, you should stand up for them, but you should do it with dignity." The 6-year-old's voice was clear and steady, carrying a maturity that silenced the entire table. "My mama is a good person, and Brian is my family now too. If you can't be nice to them, maybe you shouldn't eat dinner with us." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only when Eduardo began to chuckle, then laugh outright. "Leo, that was perfectly said. Carlos, I believe my grandson has given you something to think about." Brian felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with Leo's defense of him, and everything to do with the boy's courage in standing up for what was right. Emma's eyes were bright with tears of joy, and even Carlos's wife looked impressed by Leo's composure. From that night forward, the family dynamics shifted perceptibly. Carlos remained distant but stopped his subtle attacks, and his children began to seek out Leo's company more often. Brian's position as Leo's chosen father figure was accepted, if not always enthusiastically embraced by all family members. The work of being Eduardo's estate manager proved challenging, but rewarding. Brian's practical skills and natural leadership abilities were well suited to overseeing the complex operations of the property, and he found genuine satisfaction in improving systems and solving problems. Eduardo proved to be a demanding but fair employer, and their mutual respect grew as they worked together on various projects. Leo thrived in his new environment, dividing his time between private tutoring, play with his cousins, and continued projects with Brian. The boy's intelligence continued to astound his teachers, but Brian made sure to balance academic advancement with normal childhood experiences. Their weekend projects became legendary among the estate staff, who would often find excuses to observe Leo's latest creations. Emma's adjustment was perhaps the most complex. Her return to wealth and status was complicated by her memories of how Roberto's family had treated her. But Eduardo's obvious remorse and effort to include her in family decisions gradually eased her wariness. She took over management of Leo's trust fund paperwork and educational planning, her accounting background proving invaluable in navigating the complex financial structures. The first crisis came 6 months after their arrival, when Leo's other grandfather, Emma's father, appeared unexpectedly at the estate. Miguel Santos was a proud man who had worked construction his entire life, and he was deeply suspicious of the Rodriguez family's sudden interest in reclaiming Emma and Leo. "My daughter calls me from a mansion, telling me she's living with some rich old man and the gringo who helped them," Miguel said bluntly during his first meeting with Eduardo. "I want to see for myself that my grandson is really okay and not just some rich man's toy." Brian found himself in the unique position of mediating between two grandfathers from completely different worlds, both of whom loved Leo deeply but had vastly different ideas about what was best for him. Eduardo's patrician reserve clashed with Miguel's direct confrontational style, and Leo was caught in the middle, trying to show both men that he was happy and well cared for. The breakthrough came when Miguel observed one of Leo's workshop sessions with Brian. The old construction worker immediately recognized the quality of Leo's work and the patience of Brian's teaching. When Leo proudly showed his great-grandfather a small table he had built entirely himself, Miguel's skepticism began to crumble. "The boy has good hands," Miguel told Brian privately later that day. "And you teach him right. Not just how to use tools, but how to respect the work." He paused, studying Brian with the assessing gaze of a man accustomed to judging character quickly. "And that shows well when she trusted you." The validation from Miguel meant more to Brian than all of Eduardo's praise and financial generosity combined. This man represented Emma and Leo's roots, their connection to a world of honest work and simple values that Brian understood and respected. His approval felt like a bridge between the modest life they had shared and the complex future they were building together. As Leo's 7th birthday approached, Brian found himself reflecting on the extraordinary year that had transformed all their lives. The small boy who had arrived at his door, frightened and silent, had grown into a confident, capable child who moved easily between the worlds of wealth and working-class values. Emma had regained her strength and found her place as both a mother and a manager of complex family interests. And Brian himself had discovered capabilities and opportunities he never could have imagined. The birthday party was a carefully orchestrated affair that balanced Leo's new status with his desire for normalcy. Eduardo insisted on inviting important family friends and business associates, while Leo requested that all the estate staff's children be included, along with Sophie and Brian's parents, who had driven up from their retirement community. Watching Leo move confidently among guests ranging from construction workers to corporate executives, Brian realized that the boy was developing exactly the kind of character that would serve him well as he grew into his inheritance. He was equally comfortable discussing building techniques with Miguel's friends and investment strategies with Eduardo's business partners, but more importantly, he treated everyone with the same respect and genuine interest. The party's highlight was Leo's demonstration of the grandfather clock he and Brian had been building together for months. The intricate mechanism represented the culmination of everything Leo had learned about precision, patience, and craftsmanship. As the clock chimed for the first time, marking the hour with perfect accuracy, the assembled guests broke into spontaneous applause. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eduardo said, his voice carrying across the gathering, "my grandson Leo has learned many things this year, but perhaps the most important is that true wealth lies not in what you own, but in the relationships you build and the skills you develop. Brian has taught him that anything worth having requires dedication, patience, and respect for the process of creation." He paused, his eyes finding Brian in the crowd. "I have learned this year that family is not always about blood, and that love often comes from the most unexpected places. Brian Matthews came into our lives as a stranger who showed kindness to people in need. He has become family through choice, commitment, and the daily acts of care that define real parenthood." End quote. Brian felt tears prick his eyes as Eduardo continued. "Therefore, it is my pleasure to announce that Brian has agreed to become Leo's legal guardian, sharing custody with Emma, and taking on the formal responsibilities of fatherhood that he has already been fulfilling in every way. That matters." The announcement was news to most of the guests, though Emma and Leo had been part of the decision-making process for weeks. The legal arrangements were complex, involving modifications to trust structures and inheritance plans, but Eduardo had insisted that Leo needed the security of knowing Brian's role in his life was permanent and protected. Sophie squealed with delight at the news, immediately demanding to know if this meant Leo was officially her brother now. Miguel Santos nodded his approval, having grown to respect Brian's character and commitment over the months of observation. And Leo himself beamed with happiness, finally having the security he had craved since his father's death. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Brian found himself alone with Eduardo on the terrace overlooking the estate grounds. The older man had been unusually reflective all evening, and Brian sensed he had something important to say. "Brian, I want you to understand what you've given Leo this year," Eduardo began, his voice thoughtful. "When Emma and Leo disappeared, I was devastated by my own family's failures. Carlos had convinced me that Emma was keeping Leo away out of spite. And I was so angry that I didn't investigate his claims properly. I nearly lost my grandson forever because I trusted the wrong people." He paused, swirling the brandy in his glass as he gathered his thoughts. "You gave Leo something I couldn't provide with all my wealth and influence. You gave him unconditional acceptance and the knowledge that he was valued for who he is, not what he represents. That foundation will serve him well when he eventually takes over Rodriguez Industries." Brian watched Leo through the window, seeing the boy helping Emma clean up party debris with the same careful attention he brought to their workshop projects. Eduardo? Leo is going to face challenges that neither of us can fully prepare him for. The combination of wealth and responsibility he'll inherit would be overwhelming for anyone, let alone someone who experienced the trauma he went through with your son. Which is why your presence in his life is so crucial, Eduardo replied. Leo needs to remember that real strength comes from character, not from money or power. He needs someone who will tell him the truth even when it's difficult, someone who values his happiness over his utility to the burl coat. Family business. The conversation was interrupted by Leo himself, who bounded onto the terrace with his usual energy. Brian, Mama says I can stay up late tonight since it's my birthday. Will you help me work on the music box for Sophie? I want to get the mechanism perfect before her next visit. Brian smiled, ruffling Leo's hair affectionately. Of course, but remember what we discussed about precision work when you're tired. Sometimes it's better to wait until you're fresh rather than risk making mistakes that we'll have to fix later. Leo nodded seriously, then climbed onto the chair beside Eduardo. Abuelo, thank you for letting Brian be part of our family officially. I was scared that maybe someday you might change your mind and make him leave. Eduardo's expression softened as he looked at his grandson. Leo, families that choose each other are often stronger than families that are only connected by blood. Brian chose to love you and your mother when you needed help. And that kind of choice creates bonds that cannot be broken by circumstances or time. The wisdom in Eduardo's words struck Brian deeply. Over the past year, he had learned that love was indeed a choice that had to be made repeatedly, in small daily actions and major life decisions. His choice to open his door to Emma and Leo had led to choices about changing jobs, moving homes, and taking on responsibilities he never expected. Each choice had been made freely, motivated by love rather than obligation. As summer progressed, Brian's role in Leo's life became more clearly defined. He handled the day-to-day aspects of parenting, from bedtime stories to discipline when necessary, while Emma managed Leo's education, and Eduardo oversaw the gradual introduction to family business crat. Responsibilities. The division of labor worked well, giving Leo multiple sources of support and guidance. The most challenging aspect of their new life was navigating the social expectations that came with wealth. Eduardo insisted that Leo attend certain social functions and family gatherings, events that often felt artificial and performative to Brian. Leo himself was remarkably adaptable, seeming to understand instinctively when to display his knowledge of business matters and when to simply be a child. One particularly difficult evening involved a dinner party for Rodriguez Industries board members, several of whom had questioned Leo's disappearance and Eduardo's subsequent restructuring of company leadership. Leo was expected to make an appearance, demonstrating his well-being and continued connection to the family business. I don't understand why I have to talk to these people about money and companies, Leo confided to Brian as they prepared for the dinner. They look at me like I'm a thing they want to own, not a person they want to know. Brian knelt down to Leo's level, adjusting the boy's tie with careful precision. Sometimes, Leo, we have to do things we don't enjoy because they're important for protecting the people we care about. Your grandfather needs these people to see that you're happy and well cared for, so they won't try to challenge the arrangements he's made to protect your inheritance. But you'll be there with me, right? Leo asked, his voice carrying the uncertainty that still surfaced when he felt overwhelmed by adult responsibilities. I'll be right there beside you, Brian promised. And if you get uncomfortable, just look at me and I'll find a way to help you step away for a few minutes. The dinner proved to be exactly as artificial as Brian had feared, with board members asking Leo carefully constructed questions designed to assess his intelligence and fitness for eventual leadership. Leo handled himself with remarkable poise, discussing his education and interests with appropriate enthusiasm while avoiding the trap of appearing too precocious or rehearsed. The evening's most significant moment came when one of the board members, a woman named Patricia Vega, who had been Roberto's mentor, asked Leo what he had learned during his time away from the estate. Leo's answer surprised everyone in the room. I learned that being rich doesn't make you a good person, and being poor doesn't make you a bad person, Leo said with the direct honesty that had become his trademark. I learned that people who work with their hands are just as smart as people who work with money, and I learned that the best families are the ones where people choose to take care of each other, not just the ones where people are. Related. The silence that followed was profound, broken only when Patricia began to chuckle. Eduardo, your grandson is going to be a formidable businessman someday, but more importantly, he's going to be a decent human being. That combination is rare in our world. As autumn approached, Brian found himself settling into rhythms that felt both new and deeply familiar. His work managing the estate provided intellectual challenges and creative opportunities, while his relationship with Leo continued to deepen through shared projects and daily interactions. Emma had begun to relax into her role as well, her natural intelligence and organizational skills making her invaluable in managing the complex logistics of Leo's education and social obligations. The first major test of their new family structure came when Leo's school recommended that he skip a grade, possibly two, based on his academic performance and testing scores. The decision required careful consideration of Leo's emotional and social development alongside his intellectual capabilities. He's clearly capable of handling more advanced academic work, the school psychologist explained during a meeting with Brian, Emma, and Eduardo. But we need to consider whether accelerating his education would isolate him from peers or put additional pressure on him that might be counterproductive. Emma was torn between pride in her son's abilities and concern about pushing him too hard too fast. Leo has already been through so much change and adjustment this year. I don't want to add more stress by making him feel different from other children his age. Eduardo's perspective was characteristically focused on long-term implications. Leo will need advanced education to prepare him for the responsibilities he'll inherit, but he also needs to develop the social skills and emotional intelligence that come from interacting with peers. Brian found himself in the position of advocate for Leo's preferences and emotional needs. What does Leo want to do? Has anyone asked him how he feels about potentially skipping grades? The question prompted a family meeting that evening, with Leo at the center of a discussion about his future. The boy listened carefully to all the adult perspectives before offering his own thoughts with typical directness. I like learning new things, and sometimes my classes are too easy, Leo said thoughtfully. But I also like having friends who are my age, and I don't want to be the weird little kid in a class with bigger kids who might not want to be my friend. His answer demonstrated the emotional intelligence that impressed all the adults in his life. After considerable discussion, they reached a compromise that would allow Leo to take advanced courses in subjects where he excelled, while remaining with his age group for social activities and subjects where calm. Acceleration wasn't necessary. The solution worked well, giving Leo intellectual challenges without isolating him socially. His friendships with classmates developed naturally, and Brian was pleased to see Leo building relationships based on shared interests rather than family wealth or status. Winter brought new challenges and opportunities. Eduardo's health began to show signs of decline, nothing serious but enough to remind everyone that he was approaching 80 and would not be able to oversee Leo's development indefinitely. The realization prompted conversations about long-term planning and the gradual transfer of responsibilities to Brian and Emma. I want to be clear about expectations, Eduardo said during one of their regular meetings about Leo's future. When Leo turns 18, he will inherit controlling interest in Rodriguez Industries. But that doesn't mean he has to take active leadership immediately. The trust structure allows for continued professional management, while Leo decides how he wants to be involved. Brian appreciated Eduardo's wisdom in providing options rather than mandates. Leo should have the freedom to choose his own path, even if that path doesn't include running the family business. Exactly, Eduardo agreed. But he should also understand the opportunities and responsibilities that come with his inheritance. That's why his education needs to include practical business experience alongside academic preparation. The conversation led to arrangements for Leo to spend time with various aspects of Rodriguez Industries' operations, always accompanied by Brian or Emma to ensure the experiences remained age-appropriate, educational rather than overwhelming. Leo's first visit to a construction site managed by the company was revealing. The boy's natural curiosity and Brian's teaching had given him a solid foundation in understanding how things were built, and he asked intelligent questions that impressed the site foreman and workers. Your boy has a good eye for quality, the foreman told Brian as they watched Leo examine the foundation work with serious concentration. he spotted a problem with the rebar spacing that our inspector missed yesterday. Leo's ability to connect theoretical knowledge with practical application continued to amaze everyone around him. Whether discussing investment strategies with Eduardo's financial advisors or troubleshooting mechanical problems in Brian's workshop, the boy demonstrated an integrated understanding that suggested he would indeed be capable of handling complex responsibilities when he was older. Spring brought Leo's 8th birthday and a family celebration that reflected how much their relationships had evolved over the past 2 years. The party was smaller than the previous year's extravaganza, focused on the people who mattered most to Leo rather than social or business obligations. Sophie had become a regular presence at the estate, spending entire weekends with Brian and developing a close sibling relationship with Leo. Miguel Santos had become a frequent visitor as well, his initial suspicions replaced by genuine affection for Eduardo and respect for the family's commitment to Leo's well-being. The birthday celebration's most meaningful moment came when Leo presented gifts he had made for each of the important adults in his life. For Eduardo, he had crafted a pen holder from wood taken from his late father's favorite tree on the estate. For Emma, he had built a jewelry box with a hidden compartment, demonstrating both his woodworking skills and his understanding of his mother's need for security. For Brian, Leo had created something extraordinary, a scale model of the small house where they had first lived together, complete with tiny furniture and working lights powered by a battery system Leo had designed himself. The detail and craftsmanship were remarkable, but more importantly, the gift represented Leo's understanding of what that modest home had meant in their shared history. "I wanted you to remember our first house," Leo explained as Brian examined the intricate model. "That's where I learned that families don't need big houses or lots of money to be happy. They just need people who care about each other." Brian felt tears stinging his eyes as he pulled Leo into a tight hug. "Leo, this is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me. And you're right about families. The love is what matters, not the size of the house." As Leo grew older and more confident in his place within the family, Brian began to see glimpses of the man the boy would become. Leo's intelligence was matched by empathy and wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. He understood the weight of his future responsibilities but remained grounded in the values Brian and Emma had worked to instill. The summer of Leo's 9th year brought a major milestone when Eduardo announced his intention to begin stepping back from active management of Rodriguez Industries. The transition had been planned carefully, with professional managers taking over day-to-day operations while Eduardo retained oversight of strategic decisions and Leo's gradual introduction to the business. "I want to spend more time being a grandfather and less time being a CEO," Eduardo explained to Leo during one of their regular afternoon walks around the estate. "I want to teach you about the family history and help you understand why your inheritance matters, not just to you but to all the people whose livelihoods depend on Rodriguez Industries." Leo's response demonstrated his growing maturity. "Abuelo, I want to learn everything you can teach me, but I also want to make sure I don't disappoint all those people who are counting on me to do a good job." "That's exactly the right attitude, Mio," Eduardo replied with obvious pride. "The fact that you understand the responsibility means you're already prepared to handle it well." As autumn approached, Brian reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all to this point. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, opening his door to strangers in need, had evolved into a complex web of relationships, responsibilities, and opportunities that continued to shape all their lives. Leo was thriving academically, socially, and emotionally, his confidence growing as he mastered new skills and deepened his understanding of the world around him. Emma had found her place as both a mother and a trusted advisor in the family's business affairs, her sharp intelligence and practical experience proving invaluable in managing complex situations. Eduardo's health remained stable, allowing him to enjoy his role as grandfather while gradually transferring knowledge and responsibilities to the next generation. The estate had become a true home for all of them, a place where different backgrounds and perspectives blended into something stronger than any of them could have achieved alone. Brian's own transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic. From a divorced maintenance supervisor living paycheck to paycheck, he had become the guardian of a billionaire's heir and a trusted manager of vast resources. But more importantly, He had found his purpose in helping shape a remarkable child into the kind of person who would use great wealth and power responsibly. The approaching winter brought news that would test their family bonds in new ways. Carlos, Eduardo's son, had been arrested for embezzlement and fraud, charges that stemmed from his attempts to access Leo's trust funds through forged documents and false claims. The scandal rocked the entire Rodriguez family and threatened to bring unwanted media attention to Leo's situation. Eduardo's pain over his son's crimes was evident, but his primary concern was protecting Leo from the publicity and family turmoil. Carlos made his choices, and now he must face the consequences, Eduardo said grimly during a family meeting to discuss the situation. But Leo should not have to suffer because of his uncle's failures. Emma's reaction was more complex, mixing vindication over the exposure of Carlos's true character with worry about how the scandal might affect Leo's emotional security. Leo needs to understand what happened without feeling responsible for his uncle's actions, she said. But he also needs to know that this kind of behavior is unacceptable in our family. Brian found himself in the position of helping Leo process the complicated emotions surrounding his uncle's arrest. The boy was old enough to understand the basics of what had happened, but young enough to need guidance in separating Carlos's actions from his own worth and place in the family. "Uncle Carlos tried to steal from my trust fund?" Leo asked during one of their workshop sessions, his hands busy with a carving project while his mind worked through the implications. "That's right," Brian replied carefully. "He made some very bad choices because he wanted money that didn't belong to him. But the important thing for you to understand is that his choices have nothing to do with you or your worth as a person." Leo was quiet for several minutes, his carving knife moving with practiced precision as he shaped the piece of wood in his hands. "I'm glad you and Mama and Abuelo are honest people," he finally said. "It must be scary to not know if the people in your family really care about you or just want your money." The observation demonstrated Leo's growing understanding of the complexities that would always surround his wealth. Brian felt a surge of pride in the boy's emotional intelligence and his ability to separate genuine relationships from those motivated by financial gain. As winter deepened, the family focused on moving forward from the scandal while maintaining their commitment to Leo's development and well-being. Eduardo used the situation as a teaching opportunity, discussing with Leo the importance of choosing advisors and friends based on character rather than convenience or family connections. "Wealth attracts people who want to use you, Leo," Eduardo explained during one of their evening talks. Learning to recognize genuine relationships versus those motivated by self-interest is one of the most important skills you can develop. Leo's response showed his practical understanding of the lesson. "That's why Brian and Mama are so important, right? They cared about me before they knew about the money, so I know their love is real." "Exactly," Eduardo agreed. "And that's why their presence in your life is so valuable. They provide a foundation of genuine relationships that will help you evaluate other people's motivations as you grow older." Spring brought a sense of renewal and forward momentum. Carlos's legal troubles were resolved through plea agreements that included restitution and prison time, removing that cloud from the family's immediate concerns. Leo continued to excel in his studies while maintaining the friendships and interests that kept him grounded in normal childhood experiences. Brian's role had evolved into something that felt both natural and extraordinary. He was Leo's father in every way that mattered, providing guidance, support, and unconditional love while helping the boy navigate the unique challenges of his situation. The legal guardianship arrangements had been formalized, giving Brian equal authority with Emma in making decisions about Leo's upbringing and education. The most significant development that spring was Leo's expressed interest in spending part of this summer working on actual construction projects with some of the estate's maintenance crews. Eduardo was initially hesitant, concerned about safety and appropriateness, but Brian advocated for the experience as valuable character development. "Leo needs to understand how things are built from the ground up," Brian argued. "Working alongside the crews will teach him to respect the people who do physical labor and give him practical skills that will serve him well regardless of his future role in the business." Emma supported the idea as well, seeing it as an extension of the values they had worked to instill in Leo. "Roberto always said that you can't lead people if you don't understand their work," she added. This would give Leo that understanding in a very real way. Eduardo eventually agreed, with the stipulation that Leo's work would be carefully supervised and limited to age-appropriate tasks. The experience proved transformative for Leo, who threw himself into the work with enthusiasm and quickly earned the respect of the crew members. "Your boy has good instincts and he's not afraid of hard work," the crew chief told Brian after Leo's first week. "He asks smart questions and pays attention to the answers. Plus, he treats everyone with respect, which is more than I can say for most of the rich kids I've worked around." Leo's summer work experience became a regular part of his education, supplementing his academic studies with practical knowledge and real-world understanding of how business decisions affected actual people's lives. The combination of intellectual and experiential learning created a foundation that would serve him well when he eventually took on greater responsibilities. As Leo's 10th birthday approached, Brian found himself amazed by the transformation in all their lives over the past 4 years. The frightened, silent child who had arrived at his door had become a confident, capable boy who moved easily between boardrooms and construction sites, comfortable with both privilege and responsibility. Emma had grown into her role as both mother and business advisor, her practical intelligence and strong moral compass making her invaluable in guiding family decisions. Eduardo had found new purpose in his role as grandfather and mentor, using his experience and wisdom to prepare Leo for the future while enjoying the present relationship they had built. The birthday celebration was held at the estate but designed to feel like the modest gatherings Leo remembered from their early days with Brian. The guest list included family, close friends, estate staff, and several of Leo's classmates, creating a mixture that reflected the different aspects of Leo's life. Leo's birthday speech, delivered with the poise that had become his trademark, captured the essence of what their family had become. "4 years ago, I was scared and didn't know where I belonged," he began, his voice clear and confident. "Brian opened his door to Mama and me when we needed help, and that changed everything for all of us." He paused, looking around at the assembled guests. "I've learned that families can be created by choice, not just by blood. I'd learned that real wealth comes from having people who love you and believe in you. And I'd learned that with great opportunities come great responsibilities to other people." Brian felt tears of pride as Leo continued. "Someday I'll inherit Rodriguez Industries. And that's a big responsibility. But I know I can handle it, because I have a family that has taught me what really matters. Brian taught me that honest work has dignity. Mama taught me that intelligence without kindness is worthless. And Abuelo taught me that leadership means serving others, not just commanding them." The speech drew enthusiastic applause, but Brian was most struck by the maturity and wisdom in Leo's words. At 10 years old, the boy had already internalized lessons that many adults never learned, and his combination of privilege and humility suggested he would indeed be capable of handling the vast responsibilities awaiting him. As the celebration continued into the evening, Brian found himself in conversation with Patricia Vega, the board member who had become a family friend and informal advisor. Her assessment of Leo's development was both encouraging and thought-provoking. "Brian, you and Emma have accomplished something remarkable with Leo," she said, watching the boy interact easily with guests ranging from construction workers to corporate executives. "He has the intelligence and education to handle complex business decisions, but more importantly, he has the character to make ethical choices even when they're difficult." She paused, sipping her wine thoughtfully. "In my 40 years in business, I've seen too many wealthy families destroyed by children who inherited money without inheriting values. Leo is going to be different, and that's largely due to the foundation you've given him." Brian appreciated the praise, but remained focused on the ongoing work of raising Leo well. "He's still young, Patricia. There will be many more tests and challenges as he grows older and the stakes get higher." "Of course," she agreed. "But the fundamentals are solid. Leo understands that wealth is a tool, not a goal, and that leadership requires service to others. Those concepts will guide him well regardless of what specific challenges he faces." As autumn approached, bringing Leo's entry into middle school and new academic challenges, Brian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as an act of spontaneous kindness had evolved into a complex web of relationships, responsibilities, and opportunities that continued to shape all their lives in profound ways. The small bungalow where their story began felt like a lifetime ago, but Brian kept Leo's model of that house prominently displayed in his office as a reminder of where they had started and what they had built together. The simple act of opening a door to strangers in need had opened doors to possibilities none of them could have imagined. Leo was growing into exactly the kind of person Brian had hoped he would become: intelligent but humble, privileged but grounded, confident but kind. The boy's future was still unwritten, but the foundation had been laid with care, love, and unwavering commitment to his well-being above all other considerations. Emma had found her strength and purpose. No longer the frightened woman who had appeared on Brian's doorstep, but a confident mother and respected member of a family business empire. Eduardo had discovered the joy of genuine grandfatherhood, his final years enriched by the relationship he had nearly lost through his own family's failures. And Brian himself had found a life purpose he never could have anticipated, helping shape a remarkable child into a young man capable of using great wealth and power for the benefit of others. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the privilege of watching Leo grow and develop into someone who would make a positive difference in the world. As winter settled over the estate, Brian looked forward to the years ahead with excitement rather than anxiety. There would be new challenges, certainly, as Leo navigated adolescence and eventually took on greater responsibilities within Rodriguez Industries. But the foundation they had built together, rooted in love, respect, and shared values, would provide the strength needed to face whatever came next. The story that had begun with a simple act of kindness continued to unfold, its ultimate ending still unknown, but its direction clear. A frightened child had become a confident young man, a desperate mother had found her place in the world, and a single father had discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as unexpected responsibilities. Their family, created by choice rather than birth, bonded by love rather than obligation, had proven that the most important inheritances are not financial but emotional, not material but moral. Leo would indeed inherit billions of dollars and vast business interests, but his true inheritance was the knowledge that he was loved unconditionally and the values that would guide him in using his wealth responsibly. As Brian tucked Leo into bed that night, listening to the boy's excited plans for upcoming projects and future adventures, he smiled at the thought of how much their lives had changed since that rainy November evening when he first opened his door to strangers in need. The decision to help had transformed not just Emma and Leo's lives, but his own as well, proving that kindness, when freely given, often returns multiplied beyond measure. The luxury sedan that had once seemed so out of place in his modest neighborhood now sat in the estate's garage, a symbol of how far they had all traveled together. But more important than any material changes were the bonds they had forged and the legacy they were building for Leo's future. A legacy measured not in dollars, but in the lives touched and improved by their unlikely Dasha. Families journeyed together,